The paper landed on the table before Eleanor Voss had even taken off her coat. "Sign here," said the lawyer, sliding it toward her with 2 fingers, like it was something he did not want to touch for too long. 2 million. That is what the family is offering, twice what you asked for. Eleanor did not sit down right away. She looked at the number printed at the bottom of the page, black ink on white paper, and felt nothing move inside her chest. No excitement, no relief, just a strange, cold quiet, the kind that comes right before a decision that will change everything. Across the room, Duke Whitmore Ashford sat with his hands folded on his cane, watching her the way a man watches a horse he is about to buy. He had expected tears. He had expected gratitude. He had expected her to grab the pen and run. "You look surprised," he said, his voice smooth as always, the voice of a man who had never once been told no in his own house. "Most people would be thanking me right now." "Most people are not me," Eleanor said quietly. She finally sat down across from him, folding her hands the same way he had folded his, though she did not notice she was doing it. Behind her, through the tall office windows, the city moved on without knowing what was happening in this one room. Cars, buses, people walking fast toward lives that did not involve signing away their marriage for money. 3 years ago, Eleanor had walked into the Ashford family home believing she had found something rare. Duke's son, Nathaniel, had been kind in the beginning, the kind that makes a person forget to ask questions. He opened doors. He remembered small things she said in passing. He made her feel like the only person in a house full of expensive furniture and colder people. But kindness in that house, she would learn, always came with a price tag attached, even if no one said the number out loud. The lawyer cleared his throat, pulling her back into the room. "Mrs. Ashford, if you could just—" "It is Voss," Eleanor said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "I never took the name." Duke's jaw tightened just slightly, so slightly that most people would have missed it. But Eleanor had spent 3 years learning to read the smallest movements on that man's face, the way sailors learn to read clouds before a storm. $2 million, he said again, as if repeating the number might change her mind. "That is more than fair, considering the circumstances." "The circumstances," Eleanor repeated softly, testing the word in her mouth like it tasted strange. "Is that what we are calling it now?" The room went quiet. Even the lawyer, a man paid to fill silences with paperwork, did not say anything. Eleanor thought about the past 3 years, the parties where she smiled until her face hurt, the dinners where Duke corrected her table manners in front of guests, calling it helping her adjust. The nights Nathaniel came home smelling like someone else's perfume and told her she was imagining things, that she was too sensitive, that a woman like her should be grateful for a life like this. She thought about the day she finally packed a bag and did not look back, and how relieved she had felt walking out that front door, like she had been holding her breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. Money could not buy that feeling, but apparently the Ashford family thought it could rent her silence instead. "I want to make one thing clear," Eleanor said, looking directly at Duke now. "I am not signing this because of the number." Duke smiled the way he always smiled when he thought he had already won. "Of course, dear. No one signs for the money. They sign because it is the right thing to do." "No," Eleanor said. "I am signing because I want to leave. The money is not the point. It was never the point." The lawyer glanced between them, sensing something shifting in the room that he could not quite name. "Then we are in agreement," Duke said, tapping his cane once against the floor, a habit he had when he wanted a conversation to end. "Sign, and this all becomes a memory. A generous memory, might I add." Eleanor picked up the pen. It felt heavier than it should have, heavier than a simple piece of plastic and ink had any right to feel. She thought about crossing out the number. She thought about the lawyer's face if she did. She thought about Duke's cane tapping faster and faster as his calm control slipped away from him for the first time in years. She smiled just slightly, the kind of smile that made people nervous because they could not read what was behind it. Actually, she said, setting the pen down instead of signing, I would like to change the number. Duke's cane stopped moving mid-tap. Excuse me. I do not want $2 million, Eleanor said, her voice steady, almost gentle. I want one. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Voss watched the Duke of the Ashford family lose his words completely. The lawyer actually laughed, a short, nervous sound, before catching himself and going quiet again. He looked at Duke, waiting for some kind of signal, some sign of how to handle a woman who had just turned down $1 million of free money sitting right in front of her. Duke did not laugh. His fingers tightened around the top of his cane until his knuckles went pale. I do not understand, he said slowly, each word careful, like he was walking across ice he was not sure would hold his weight. We offered you double what your own lawyer asked for. Are you telling me you want less? I am telling you exactly that, Eleanor said. She had rehearsed this moment in her head so many times over the past few weeks, lying awake at night in the small apartment she had rented after leaving the Ashford house, staring at a ceiling that was not decorated by someone else's taste for the first time in years. In every version of this moment in her mind, she had imagined feeling powerful, triumphant, like a woman finally winning against people who thought they could never lose. But sitting here now, watching Duke's calm crack open like dry earth after years without rain, she did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that, something closer to peace. Do you know why your family offered me twice what I asked for? Eleanor asked, tilting her head slightly. Duke did not answer. His silence was answer enough. Because you wanted this to be over quickly, Eleanor continued. Because a big number makes a story disappear fast. People stop asking questions when the number is big enough to distract them. You are not being generous, Duke. You are buying my silence at a premium price. That is a very cynical way to see a simple business transaction, Duke said, though his voice had lost some of its usual smoothness. Maybe, Eleanor said, but I have had 3 years inside your family to learn how business transactions work in this house. The lawyer shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, clearly wishing he was anywhere else in the building right now. So why half? Duke finally asked, his voice quieter now, almost curious despite himself. If not for some kind of statement, then why? Eleanor looked down at the paper for a long moment before answering. Because I do not want your family's money defining how I start my life over, she said. $1 million is enough for me to build something on my own terms. $2 million would mean I owe your family a story about how grateful I am. I do not want to carry that story with me. Duke stared at her, and for the first time since she had known him, Eleanor saw something in his eyes that was not calculation. It looked almost like respect, though buried under decades of a man who did not know how to show that emotion without also showing weakness. You surprise me, Eleanor, he said finally. Good, she said. I would hate to be predictable. She picked the pen back up, crossed out the number on the page with one clean line, and wrote the new number beside it in her own handwriting. Then she signed her name below it, the same signature she had used her entire life, long before she had ever heard the name Ashford. The lawyer took the paper back with careful hands, like it might still change if he was not gentle with it. This is unusual, he muttered, mostly to himself. Get used to it, Eleanor said, standing up and finally taking off her coat, draping it over her arm instead. I have a feeling I am going to be unusual for a while. Duke watched her walk toward the door, his cane resting silently against his knee now. No more tapping, no more performance. Just an old man sitting in an expensive office, realizing that for the first time in a very long time, someone had walked away from his money without looking back. Eleanor, he called out just as she reached the door. She paused, hand on the handle, but did not turn around. Why does this feel like you have won something? He asked, and there was something almost honest in the question, something that sounded less like the Duke everyone knew and more like a man asking a genuine question he did not know the answer to. Elinor thought about it for a moment. "Because I have," she said simply. Then she opened the door and walked out into the hallway, leaving the paper, the number, and the man who thought money could buy anything sitting quietly behind her. Outside, the city was still moving, cars and buses and people walking fast toward their own lives. Elinor stepped into the afternoon light and took a breath that felt different than any breath she had taken in 3 years. Lighter somehow, like she had finally set down something heavy she had been carrying without even realizing how much it weighed. She did not know yet what the coming weeks would bring. She did not know that this small act of taking less money instead of more would travel through offices and dinner tables far beyond that lawyer's room, whispered about by people who could not understand why anyone would turn down free money. She did not know that Duke would spend the following days replaying this conversation over and over, trying to understand a decision that broke every rule he had built his entire life around. All Elinor knew, standing on that sidewalk with her coat over her arm and the sound of the city around her, was that she had just done something no one expected. And somewhere behind that glass office window 3 floors above her, an old man who was used to being the most powerful person in any room was sitting completely still, staring at a signed piece of paper that told him, for the very first time, that not everyone could be bought. She started walking, and she did not look back. Elinor did not go home right away. She walked for almost an hour, past shops she did not enter and cafes she did not stop at, letting the city carry her forward while her mind stayed several steps behind in that office with the cane and the paper in Duke's face when the number changed. It was strange, she thought, how a single sentence could rearrange a room so completely. She had said 6 words, and the most powerful man she had ever known had gone quiet for the first time in 3 years. By the time she reached her apartment, the sun was low over the buildings, painting the windows gold. It was a small place, nothing like the house she had shared with Nathaniel, nothing like the marble floors and the paintings that cost more than most people's yearly salary. But it was hers. Every crack in the paint, every creak in the floor belonged to no one but her. She dropped her keys on the small kitchen counter and stood there for a moment just breathing. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She almost ignored it, but something made her check. It was a message from her closest friend, Margaret, who had been the only person from Elinor's old life who never once stopped calling, even after Elinor had gone quiet for weeks trying to figure out how to leave a marriage that looked perfect from the outside and felt like a slow, disappearing act on the inside. The message was simple. How did it go? Elinor sat down at her small kitchen table and typed back just as simply, "I signed for half." 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared, then appeared again, like Margaret was typing and deleting several responses before settling on one. "Half of what they offered, or half of what you asked for?" "Half of what they offered," Elinor wrote back. "I asked for 1, they offered 2, I took 1. The phone rang less than a second later. Elinor smiled before she even answered it. "Are you out of your mind?" Margaret's voice came through, half laughing, half serious, the way it always did when she was trying to figure out whether to be worried or impressed. "Maybe a little," Elinor admitted, leaning back in her chair. "Elinor, that is real money. That is not pretend money. That is the kind of money that changes your whole life, and you just handed half of it back to a family that treated you like furniture for 3 years. "I know," Elinor said. "I was there." "So why?" Margaret asked, and this time her voice had lost the teasing edge. She actually wanted to know. Elinor looked around her small kitchen, at the single mug drying on the rack, at the plant on the windowsill she had bought herself the week she moved in, the first thing in years that was hers simply because she wanted it, not because someone else had chosen it for the house. "Because I did not want to leave with a debt I could not see," Elinor said slowly, trying to find the right words. If I took the 2 million, it would always feel like I was being paid to disappear quietly, like there was an amount of money that made 3 years of feeling small worth it. I do not want that math in my head for the rest of my life." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That is either the smartest thing you have ever said," Margaret finally replied, "or the most stubborn." "Probably both," Eleanor said, and for the first time that day she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere honest instead of somewhere performed. They talked for another hour, about nothing important, about plans for dinner later that week, about a job opening Margaret had heard of at a design firm downtown, that Eleanor might actually be interested in applying for now that her days were no longer filled with charity luncheons and family obligations that were never really about family at all. After they hung up, Eleanor made herself a simple dinner and sat by the window eating it slowly, watching the city lights begin to switch on one by one across the skyline. She thought about the last 3 years the way someone thinks about a long illness they have finally recovered from, remembering the pain clearly but from a distance now, like it belonged to a different version of herself. She had met Nathaniel Ashford at a charity dinner she had only attended because a friend from work could not make it and did not want to waste the ticket. She remembered exactly what she had been wearing, a simple dark green dress she had bought on sale, feeling slightly out of place among women in gowns that cost more than her monthly rent. Nathaniel had found her standing near the dessert table, laughing quietly to herself at how seriously everyone around her was discussing wine, and he had said something clever enough to make her laugh out loud instead. In the beginning, he made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered she liked her coffee with too much cream and not enough sugar. He remembered the name of her childhood dog, mentioned once in passing, months later like it mattered. She had not known then that remembering small details was simply a skill. Some people used to make other people feel valuable right up until the moment they no longer needed to bother. The change had not happened all at once. That was the part Eleanor found hardest to explain to people who asked why she had stayed as long as she did. It was not one large moment of realization. It was hundreds of small ones, stacked so slowly on top of each other that she had not noticed the weight building until she was already buried under it. It started with small comments about her clothes, dressed up as helpful advice. Then comments about how she spoke at dinner parties, dressed up as concern for how she was perceived. Then Duke's corrections at the table, delivered with a smile so warm that anyone watching would have thought he was being kind. Then the nights Nathaniel came home late, smelling like perfume that was not hers, followed by explanations that grew more elaborate and less believable each time. Eleanor had spent months convincing herself that she was imagining patterns that were not really there, that she was simply too sensitive, too dramatic, too much like the version of herself Duke and Nathaniel kept telling her she needed to fix. It was Margaret, eventually, who had said the thing that finally broke through the fog. They had been having coffee, a rare outing Eleanor had actually been allowed to attend without questions, and Margaret had simply looked at her and said, "You used to laugh with your whole face. When did you stop doing that?" Eleanor had not had an answer. She still was not entirely sure when it had stopped, but she remembered exactly the moment she decided to start again. It had been a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what happened inside her own head. Nathaniel had come home late again, and instead of offering an explanation, he had simply looked at her with something close to boredom. As if her question about where he had been was an inconvenience, rather than something she deserved an answer to. In that moment, standing in the hallway of a house that had never once felt like home, Eleanor had understood something with a clarity that surprised her. She was not asking a question because she needed an answer. She already knew the answer. She was asking because some small part of her still hoped he would care enough to lie better. That was the night she started packing, quietly, one drawer at a time, over the following weeks, so no one would notice until she was ready to leave completely. Sitting now in her small apartment, finishing the last bites of a simple dinner she had made for herself, Alina realized that today's decision, the one Margaret had called stubborn and smart in the same breath, had actually started that night in the hallway. Every choice since then had simply been following the same thread back to herself. The next morning, Alina woke up early, earlier than she needed to, and made coffee just the way she liked it, with too much cream and not enough sugar. Only now it was a choice she made because it was hers, not a detail someone else had once used to make her feel important. She had barely finished her first cup when her phone rang. She did not recognize the number, but something made her answer anyway. Alina Voss. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional, slightly rushed. "Speaking," she said, setting her cup down carefully. "My name is Clara Whitfield. I write for the City Business Journal. I understand you were involved in a settlement yesterday with the Ashford family." Alina's stomach tightened slightly. "I am not sure how you would know that." "These things travel fast in certain circles," Clara said, and Alina could hear the smile in her voice, the kind of smile reporters had when they knew they were sitting on something interesting. "I heard you turned down twice the amount that was offered to you. Is that true?" Alina was quiet for a moment, staring out her small kitchen window at the morning light spreading slowly across the rooftops of the city. "Where did you hear that?" she asked carefully. "I have a source close to the family," Clara said. "I am not able to share who, but I can tell you this story is already starting to move. People find it fascinating. A woman turning down free money from one of the wealthiest families in the state. It does not happen often." Alina thought about Duke sitting in that office yesterday, his cane finally still, his calm finally cracked. She wondered if he had told someone himself, perhaps without meaning to, still trying to process what had happened. Or perhaps it was the lawyer, unable to keep such an unusual story to himself. "I do not have anything to say about it," Alina finally answered. "Would you be willing to meet and talk, off the record at first? I think there is more to this story than a number on a page, and I would rather hear it from you than piece it together from rumors." Alina looked around her apartment, small and quiet and entirely her own, and thought about how quickly the outside world seemed determined to pull her back into a story that was not finished being told on their terms. "I will think about it," she said, and hung up before Clara could respond. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time after that, coffee going cold in front of her, wondering how many more people already knew what had happened in that office. And wondering, with a small flicker of unease she could not quite explain, what Duke Ashford might do now that his careful, controlled world had been shaken by a woman he had once been certain he could simply pay to disappear. Duke Ashford did not sleep well that night. He was not a man who often admitted such things, even to himself, but the truth sat heavy in his chest as he stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, listening to the old house creak around him the way it always did after midnight. 68 years old, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone had told him no in a way that actually meant it. He rose before dawn, as he always did, and made his way down to the study where he kept the family's most important papers locked away in a cabinet only he had the key to. He sat at his desk and pulled out the signed settlement, running his fingers over Alina's crossed-out number, and her new number written beside it in careful, steady handwriting. He had expected many things from this negotiation. He had prepared for tears, for anger, for a lawyer trying to squeeze out more money than the family was willing to pay. He had even prepared for the possibility that Alina might try to make trouble, might try to take some part of the family's reputation down with her on her way out the door. Duke had contingency plans for all of that. He always did. It was how he had built the family's fortune over 4 decades, by preparing for every possible outcome before anyone else in the room even realized there were outcomes to prepare for. He had never prepared for someone asking for less. His son Nathaniel found him there an hour later, still staring at the paper, coffee gone cold beside him. "You look like you did not sleep," Nathaniel said, leaning against the doorway with the same easy confidence he always carried, a confidence Duke had spent years building in him, though lately he wondered if he had built something else along with it, something harder to name. "I did not," Duke admitted. Nathaniel walked further into the room and glanced at the paper on the desk, still thinking about the settlement. "She turned down $1 million, Duke said, as if saying it out loud again might finally make it make sense. $1 million, Nathaniel, sitting right there on the table, hers for the taking, and she crossed it out. Nathaniel shrugged, the kind of easy shrug that came from a man who had never once had to think seriously about $1 million in his entire life. Maybe she felt guilty. Alina did not have anything to feel guilty about, Duke said sharply, surprising even himself with the edge in his voice. Nathaniel's easy expression faltered slightly. "I did not say she did. I am just saying maybe that is what it was." Duke looked at his son for a long moment, really looked at him, the way he had not allowed himself to in longer than he cared to admit. Nathaniel had his mother's eyes and his own stubbornness, but somewhere along the way, raised in a house that measured love in comparisons and corrections, he had learned that people were simply pieces to be moved around a board, useful until they were not. Duke wondered, sitting there in the quiet study with the sun barely rising outside the window, how much of that lesson Nathaniel had learned from watching his own father operate for 35 years. "Sit down," Duke said. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow but did as he was told, settling into the chair across from his father's desk, the same chair Alina had sat in the day before, though neither of them mentioned that. "Tell me honestly," Duke said, "what happened between you and Alina? The real reason, not the version you have been telling me for months." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Does it matter now? The settlement is signed. It is over." "It matters to me," Duke said, and something in his voice made Nathaniel actually pause before answering. "I got bored," Nathaniel finally said, quietly, like the words cost him something to admit. "She was interesting in the beginning, different from the women I usually met. She actually had opinions, she actually pushed back when I said something stupid. I liked that at first. And then it got exhausting," Nathaniel said, looking down at his hands. "Having someone who actually looked at you, really looked, and expected you to be honest all the time. It is easier to be with someone who does not ask so many questions." Duke sat back in his chair, absorbing this, feeling something uncomfortable settle in his chest that he did not immediately recognize as guilt, because guilt was not an emotion he allowed himself often. "So you made her feel small," Duke said slowly, "because it was easier than being honest with her." Nathaniel did not answer, which was answer enough. Duke thought about his own marriage decades ago to a woman who had also once looked at him the way Alina must have once looked at Nathaniel, with real interest, real hope. He thought about how that woman had slowly grown quieter over the years they were married, how her opinions had softened into agreements, how her laugh, which he remembered had once filled entire rooms, had eventually shrunk down into something polite and small. He had told himself for years that this was simply what happened as people grew older, as marriages settled into comfortable routines. Sitting here now, looking at his son and thinking about Alina crossing out $1 million because she refused to let money buy her silence about how she had been treated, Duke wondered, for the first time in a very long time, if he had been wrong about a great many things. "I want you to leave me alone with my thoughts for a while," Duke said quietly. Nathaniel stood, clearly relieved to end the conversation, and left the study without another word. Duke sat alone for a long time after that, the settlement paper still in front of him, Alina's steady handwriting staring back at him like a small, quiet challenge he had not expected and did not know how to answer. By afternoon, the story had already begun spreading through certain circles of the city, exactly as the reporter Clara Whitfield had told Alina it would. Duke's assistant, a sharp young man named Oliver who had worked for the family for nearly 6 years, brought him a folder of clippings and printed articles that had appeared online overnight, each one telling some version of the same story with varying degrees of accuracy. One headline read simply, "Ashford family offers millions, woman takes half." Another was more dramatic, claiming Alina had shocked the wealthy Ashford dynasty with an act of quiet defiance. Duke read through several of them, his frustration growing with each one, not because they were untrue exactly, but because they were being told without him about him in a way he had never experienced before in his life. For 4 decades, Duke Ashford had controlled every story that involved his family's name. He had donated to the right causes, sat on the right boards, made the right calls to the right editors whenever something inconvenient threatened to surface. He had built an entire structure around protecting the family's image, brick by careful brick, and now here was a story slipping past all of it, spreading through the city on its own momentum, fueled by nothing more than one woman's decision to want less money than she was offered. "Do you want me to make some calls?" Oliver asked carefully, watching Duke's expression as he read through the clippings. "We could probably slow this down, maybe stop it from spreading further." Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring at a photograph someone had found of Alina from years earlier, taken at some charity event, smiling in a way that looked genuinely happy, back before Duke's family had gotten its hands on her. "No," Duke finally said, surprising himself with the answer. "Let it spread." Oliver blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Sir, I have spent my entire life controlling stories," Duke said slowly, more to himself than to his assistant. "Maybe it is time I let one tell itself honestly for once." That evening, Duke found himself, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, driving across the city toward the small apartment building where he had learned, through his own careful channels, that Alina had been staying since she left his family's house. He sat outside in his car for nearly 20 minutes before finding the courage to get out, an old man in an expensive coat standing on an unfamiliar sidewalk, feeling more uncertain than he had felt in years. He knocked on her door, and when Alina opened it, her expression shifted quickly from surprise to something more guarded. "Duke," she said carefully, "this is unexpected." "May I come in?" he asked. "I promise this is not about the settlement, I only want to talk." Alina studied him for a long moment, and Duke understood, standing there on her doorstep, that he had spent 3 years being someone she had every reason not to trust. He waited, unsure what he would do if she said no, unsure what he even hoped to accomplish here beyond a need he could not fully name to understand the woman who had turned down his money, and in doing so, had turned something loose inside him that he had kept locked away for decades. Finally, Alina stepped back and opened the door wider. "5 minutes," she said. "That is all I can offer you." Duke stepped into her small apartment, so different from the house she had once lived in, and felt, strangely, more comfortable here than he had felt in his own home in years. There was nothing performed about this space, nothing chosen to impress anyone, just a woman's life, simple and honest, laid out in front of him. "I read the articles," Duke said, standing awkwardly near the door, unsure where to sit without being invited. "About the settlement." "I did not talk to any reporters," Alina said quickly, "if that is what you are here about." "I know," Duke said. "I believe you. I think perhaps it was someone on my own side who could not keep quiet." Alina crossed her arms, waiting, not offering him a chair, not making this easy for him, and Duke found he respected her for that more than he expected to. "I came here," Duke said slowly, choosing his words with more care than he had used in a long time, "because I have spent the last day trying to understand why a decision that cost you money has made me feel like I lost something far bigger." Alina's expression softened slightly, though she remained cautious. "What do you think you lost?" Duke was quiet for a moment, looking around her small, honest apartment, thinking about his own house full of expensive things that had never once made him feel as settled as this simple space seemed to make her feel. "I think," he said finally, "I lost the chance to know what it actually looks like when someone in my family is loved correctly, instead of managed." The words hung in the air between them, more honest than anything Duke had said out loud in years, and even he seemed surprised he had said them. Alina did not respond right away. She walked slowly to her small window and looked out at the city lights beginning to appear across the darkening sky, thinking about 3 years of her life spent inside a house that had taught her, slowly and carefully, that love and management could look exactly the same from the outside if you did not know what you were looking for. "You did not lose the chance," she finally said, turning back to face him. "You are just seeing it clearly for the first time. There is still time to change what happens next, Duke, just maybe not with me." Duke absorbed this, nodding slowly, understanding, for perhaps the first time in his long and carefully controlled life, that some things could not be bought back no matter how much money a person had sitting in the bank. "Thank you for the 5 minutes," he said quietly and let himself out. Alina stood by her window for a long time after he left, watching his car pull away from the curb below, feeling something complicated settle in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Not quite forgiveness, not quite closure, something in between, something that felt strangely like the beginning of a story rather than the end of one. She did not know yet that Duke Ashford, driving home through the quiet city streets that night, had already begun making a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they understood him, including, perhaps, himself. 3 weeks passed before Alina heard from anyone in the Ashford family again, and by then, her life had already begun settling into a rhythm that felt entirely her own. She had taken the job at the design firm Margaret had mentioned, a small company run by a woman named Grace Pemberton, who believed in hearing people for their honesty rather than their connections, which suited Alina perfectly after 3 years of a world built entirely on the opposite principle. Her days now started early, with coffee made just the way she liked it, followed by a walk to a small office above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of fresh bread every morning. Her evenings were quiet, filled with small projects around her apartment, dinners with Margaret twice a week, and a slowly returning sense of who she was outside of anyone else's expectations. She had almost stopped thinking about the settlement entirely when Clara Whitfield called again. "I promised I would not push," Clara said when Alina answered, "but I wanted you to know something is happening that involves you, and I thought you would rather hear it from me than read about it somewhere else." Alina set down the mug she had been drying, suddenly alert. "What kind of something?" "Duke Ashford is starting a foundation," Clara said. "A fairly significant one, from what I understand. It focuses on supporting women rebuilding their lives after difficult marriages, particularly women who might not have the resources to walk away the way you were able to." Alina was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "He is nomming it after you," Clara added carefully. "Or at least that is what my source is telling me, the Voss Foundation." Alina sat down slowly at her kitchen table, the phone still pressed to her ear, feeling something complicated rise in her chest that she had not expected. Part of her wanted to be angry, wanted to see this as another version of the same pattern, another attempt by the Ashford family to use her name for something that made them look generous without actually costing them anything real. But another part of her, quieter and more honest, remembered the conversation in her apartment 3 weeks earlier, Duke standing awkwardly near her door, admitting something that had clearly cost him more than any amount of money ever could. "Has he tried to contact me about it?" Alina asked. "Not that I know of," Clara said. "From what I understand, he has been very clear with his team that you are not to be pressured into any involvement or endorsement. He wants your name used only if you agree to it, and only in the way you would want it used." Alina thought about this for a long time after they hung up, standing at her window looking out at the same city lights she had watched with Duke that night weeks ago, wondering what it meant that a man who had spent 3 years quietly diminishing her seemed to be trying, in his own imperfect way, to build something meaningful out of the wreckage. She did not call him that night. She needed time to decide what she actually felt, separate from what she thought she was supposed to feel. A week later, an envelope arrived at her apartment, handwritten, no return address, though Alina recognized the careful, old-fashioned handwriting immediately. Inside was a single letter from Duke, longer than she expected, more honest than anything she had ever received from him during the 3 years she had known him as family. He wrote about the foundation, explaining that he had begun it not as a way to repair his public image, though he acknowledged that some people would assume that was his only motivation, but because their conversation in her apartment had opened something in him he did not know how to close again. He wrote about his own marriage, decades earlier, and a wife whose laughter he remembered fading slowly over years. He had been too focused on building wealth to notice properly. He wrote that he did not expect forgiveness, and was not asking for any, but wanted her to know that her decision to take less money instead of more had taught him something about worth that 4 decades of building a financial empire never had. The letter ended simply. You do not owe this family anything, Alina. Not your name, not your forgiveness, not your involvement. But I wanted you to know that because of you, something better might come from all of this. Whatever you decide, thank you for the 5 minutes you gave an old man who needed them more than he realized. Alina read the letter 3 times before setting it down on her kitchen table, her tea going cold beside it. She thought about Nathaniel, whom she had not heard from at all since the day she signed the settlement, still, she suspected, more concerned with his own comfort than any real reflection. She thought about the 3 years that had taught her to distrust anything that looked like kindness from that family. 3 years of learning that generosity in that house always came with strings attached, invisible until they tightened. But this letter did not feel like it was asking her for anything. It felt, strangely, like a man finally being honest simply because honesty was overdue, regardless of what it cost him or what he gained from it. She called Margaret that evening, reading her the letter over the phone, while Margaret listened quietly on the other end. "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked when Alina finished reading. "I do not know yet," Alina admitted. "Part of me wants nothing to do with any of it. Let him build his foundation, let him try to fix whatever he thinks needs fixing, but keep my name out of it entirely." "And the other part?" Margaret asked gently. Alina looked around her small apartment, at the plant on her windowsill that had grown 2 new leaves since she bought it, at the life she had slowly and carefully built for herself out of nothing but her own decisions. The other part wonders if there is a way to make sure the foundation actually helps people, instead of just making the Ashford family feel better about themselves, Alina said slowly. "If I could have some say in how it actually operates, maybe it could become something real instead of just another headline." "That sounds like you are considering getting involved," Margaret said carefully. "Maybe," Alina said. "Not for him, for the women it might actually help." The following week, Alina requested a meeting, not with Duke directly, but with the Foundation's early planning team, a small group of professionals Duke had hired who seemed genuinely committed to building something meaningful rather than simply managing an image problem. She spent 3 hours in that meeting asking hard questions, pushing back on vague plans, insisting on specific structures that would ensure the money actually reached women who needed practical help, rather than disappearing into administrative costs and public relations campaigns. By the end of the meeting, the Foundation's director, a thoughtful woman named Priya Anand, who had spent 15 years working in community support programs before Duke recruited her, looked at Alina with something close to admiration. "You know," Priya said as the meeting wrapped up, "most people in your position would have simply said yes or no and walked away either way. You actually came prepared to make this better. I did not want my name attached to something hollow, Alina said simply. If it is going to exist, it should actually work. Word of Alina's involvement, careful and deliberate as it was, eventually made its way back to Duke, though Alina had specifically requested that her participation remain focused on the foundation's structure rather than any public spotlight. She did not want to become a symbol. She simply wanted to make sure that if something good was going to come from 3 difficult years of her life, it would actually be good, not just look good. Duke, for his part, respected the boundary completely, communicating only through the Foundation's team, never once trying to use their history to pull her closer than she wanted to be pulled. It was, Alina thought one evening while reviewing program proposals at her kitchen table, the first time in her entire experience with that family that someone had actually respected a line she drew without trying to argue her out of it. Nathaniel, she heard through Margaret, who still had connections in that social circle, had reacted to news of the Foundation with something between confusion and quiet resentment. Unable to understand why his father was spending significant money and effort on a cause connected to the marriage, he seemed determined to remember as simply a mistake rather than something requiring reflection. Alina found she did not think about Nathaniel much anymore. He had become, in her mind, less like a person she had once loved and more like a lesson she had learned, filed away and closed, no longer requiring daily attention. 6 weeks after that first meeting in the lawyer's office, the Voss Foundation officially launched with a small announcement, deliberately modest, focused entirely on the practical support it would offer rather than any dramatic story about how it came to exist. Alina's name appeared once, in small print, as a founding advisor, exactly as much visibility as she had agreed to, and not one word more. She sat that evening on her small apartment balcony, a space barely large enough for one chair, watching the sun set over a city that had slowly become entirely hers over the past 2 months. Her phone buzzed with a message from Clara Whitfield, who had been given permission to write the Foundation's first feature story, focused entirely on its mission rather than the settlement that had inspired it. "Thank you for trusting me with this," Clara had written. "I think it is going to help a lot of people." Alina set her phone down and looked out at the darkening sky, thinking about the version of herself who had walked into that lawyer's office months earlier, expecting to simply sign a paper and disappear from a family that had spent 3 years teaching her she was replaceable. She had not disappeared. She had walked out with exactly what she needed, nothing more, nothing borrowed against her own sense of worth, and somehow, without meaning to, she had left behind something that might actually matter. She did not know yet that the Foundation's growing success would eventually bring her face to face with Duke one more time, in circumstances neither of them expected. Forcing a final conversation that would settle, once and for all, what exactly had changed between the woman who refused to be bought and the man who had finally learned, too late for his own marriage but perhaps not too late for something else, what it meant to actually listen. A year passed, quicker than Alina expected, the way time tends to move once a person stops counting the days simply to survive them, and starts counting them instead as building blocks towards something they actually want. The Voss Foundation had grown far beyond its modest beginning, now operating in 3 cities, offering not just financial support but legal guidance, housing assistance, and career counseling to women rebuilding their lives after difficult marriages. Priya Anand, still running daily operations with the same careful dedication she had shown from the first meeting, told Alina during one of their regular check-ins that the Foundation had directly helped over 400 women in its first year alone. Alina had taken on a slightly larger role over the months, though always on her own terms, always focused on the practical structure of the programs rather than any public representation of the Foundation's story. She had been promoted at the design firm, now leading a small team of her own, and had moved into a slightly larger apartment, though she kept the same small plant from her windowsill, now grown large enough to need its own corner of the living room. She had, slowly and without any dramatic turning point she could point to, become someone who recognized herself in the mirror again. It was Margaret who told her about the gala, an annual charity event the Ashford family had hosted for decades, though this year, for the first time, a portion of the proceeds would go toward the Voss Foundation, a decision made entirely by the foundation's board without any pressure from Alina, simply because it made practical sense given the growing partnership between the two organizzati.